Darkwing Duck flapped through the night and onto your NES back in 1992. Developed and published by Capcom, Darkwing Duck for the NES is based entirely on the then newly released cartoon series of the same name. The actual Darkwing Duck show was one of the later shows to come out from Disney in the early 90s as part of their whole after-school block of cartoon shows that featured the likes of DuckTales and the Rescue Rangers. And while Darkwing was never quite as popular as those shows, it still had a devoted fan base of kids that wanted something new and original from Disney rather than just reconditioning their old characters into new shows and settings, which was pretty much the norm back then. Sadly though, Darkwing only lasted a couple of seasons before it ended, but that was still more than enough time for Capcom to crank out a couple of Darkwing Duck games for the NES and Game Boy. But did Capcom do fans good with a quality take on the show? Or was this yet another rush job thrown out to eager kids looking for anything with their favorite masked duck superhero on it? Well, grab your favorite purple cape and oversized Tando. Yes, that's actually the type of hat that Darkwing wears. I swear I didn't just make that up. And let's see if Darkwing Duck for the NES is worth getting dangerous over. Start up Darkwing Duck and you're treated to a fantastic rendition of the show's intro sequence, which is always a really nice touch for a NES game. Afterward, you're immediately tossed into a quick briefing informing you that some bad guys are totally doing some bad guy stuff, and only you, Darkwing Duck, can punish them accordingly. There is a slightly more detailed story in the actual manual, but it's generally nothing more than an excuse to get a bunch of enemies into a video game for Darkwing to fight. After your super secret briefing, you're met with a stage select screen where you get a choice of 3 different stages to choose from. Each one comes with a quick description, and then you can either choose to keep browsing or go directly to the stage. There are actually more than 3 stages in the game, however, but you don't get access to those until you've beaten the first 3. So get the thunderquack in the air and get ready to stop the worst that the city of St. Canard has to throw at you. Once you're in the game, you're met with a very familiar side-scrolling action game. And when I say familiar, I mean a damn near exact copy of another very popular Capcom-owned game franchise. Yes, if you've ever played a Mega Man game before, then Darkwing Duck is gonna give you some serious deja vu. Rumored to be running on a stripped-down version of Mega Man 5's code, Darkwing seems proud to wear its similarities on its flowing purple cape. Everything from jumping, firing your gun, and just the general feel of a Mega Man game is right here in Darkwing Duck. And that's not necessarily a bad thing though, as Mega Man games are goddamn fantastic, and the same pedigree carries over wonderfully to Darkwing Duck, just toned down a bit for the younger audience. And while it may essentially be an easier, more kid-friendly Mega Man game, Darkwing does at least add some of his own superhero flair to the gameplay, including being able to hang from ledges and dodge attacks using his cape. The whole hanging from ledges thing is used a lot in the game, from getting up and over platforms to maneuvering around bosses. It's a fun mechanic that mixes up the action but can definitely feel a little awkward, especially when you're still getting used to making Darkwing attach himself to some of the smaller things he can hang from. It'll also take some conditioning to remember that Darkwing will automatically grab and hang from a ledge if you tell him to drop down from it, instead of just dropping to the floor below like every other game ever. Thankfully, it doesn't take long to master, and you'll find yourself getting around stages like a seasoned crime-fighting mallard in no time. Darkwing also gets a variety of weapon power-ups that he can use that are sitting around each stage, allowing him to use his gas gun to shoot such things as lightning bolts at angles, a gas bomb that shoots both ways across the ground, and a pretty cool arrow that you can use to make your own temporary platforms to stand on to reach areas you normally couldn't get to. These are all powered by special ammo that you can find lying around, so you can't just mindlessly go crazy with them when you find them. And unlike Mega Man, you can only ever hold on to one of these weapons at a time, so be sure to keep the ones you like best since they don't pop up too often. The Mega Man similarities continue right down to the stages, enemies, and bosses you'll be going up against in the game. The stages themselves are all nicely varied and have some fun locations in the city to play through, with each offering a nice assortment of obstacles and platforming to keep you on your toes. While the stages do owe a lot to how the Blue Bombers levels are laid out, there's no denying that they look right at home in Darkwing's fun, cartoony universe as well. Thankfully though, Darkwing Duck avoids some of the most annoying Mega Man level habits, like its non-stop love of one-hit kill obstacles and falling off platforms into abysses below. The worst thing you'll come across in Darkwing Duck are a few bottomless pits that some of the more cheaply placed enemies will likely knock you into, and a few areas where you'll need to use your hang move to navigate through some rough areas. The rest of the time though, you should be able to make your way through Darkwing's levels without too many curse words yelled at the TV. Speaking of enemies, just about every one you face will be your standard Mega Man type that you'll need to dodge, take a few shots at when you can, and then repeat until you can take them out. Most of the enemies are easy enough to learn, but every once in a while their placement and sudden appearances can send you packing back to the beginning of the stage, since you can only take a total of 4 hits from anything before you're dead. Every stage also comes with a boss at the end, and they're generally even easier than the standard enemies. Most only have a couple of attacks, with the only real challenge being avoiding them or getting in position to hit them. And even if you do manage to die at a boss, the game is nice enough to spawn you right back at them for another try. Even though all of this may sound like baby's first action game, it's still challenging enough to make each stage something that you can't just mindlessly run through. You'll need to memorize enemy placements and learn to maneuver through some tricky platforming, though none of it is ever super hard, but just challenging enough that it keeps the game fun for any skill level playing it. So yes, while Darkwing Duck is mostly just a toned-down, easier version of Mega Man in the gameplay department, I'll still take this any day over the dozens of absolutely terrible license games that I've had to endure on this console over the years. I always kind of felt bad for Darkwing Duck, since Disney finally took the risk on an original property and character, but it just never took off like they wanted it to, and poor old Darkwing is now languishing in the pits of Disney obscurity. At the very least though, we got about 60 fun cartoon episodes to watch and 2 great games out of it. And going by the quality of other even more popular franchises that managed to put out some of the worst games ever made at the time, that's actually a pretty good deal. So if you're an old fan of the series like I am, or if this is the first time you've ever even heard about Darkwing Duck, then definitely give the NES game a try. It's a lot of fun, and probably one of the better Disney licensed games on the system. You'll enjoy it even more if you're a fan of the Mega Man series, as this is almost like you're getting a weird spin-off of those games that was about a crime-fighting duck for some reason. But regardless of if you're a Darkwing fan or a Mega Man fan, I can safely say that Darkwing Duck is totally worth scouring the rooftops for. Widget shapeshifted its way onto your NES back in 1992. Developed and published by Atlas, Widget for the NES was based on the Saturday morning cartoon Widget the World Watcher, or just Widget for short. The cartoon mainly focused on a small alien that found his way to Earth to help us dumbass humans with our environmental problems, while also fighting totally evil bad guys intent on destroying our clean air and water. The main gimmick to Widget, besides being a cartoon about saving the environment, was his ability to shapeshift into various forms to solve whatever perilous situation Widget's human friends managed to find themselves in. So I guess you could sort of think of Widget as an early 90s version of the Wonder Twins, just less entertaining. Even though Widget the cartoon series wasn't exactly popular with anyone at the time, most likely due to its overly preachy environmental message that Captain Planet had thoroughly wore out years earlier, it was still worth a chance for Atlas to scoop up the rights and make a Widget video game for the NES. So was Widget a more entertaining game than cartoon series, or was it just time to tell this alien to shapeshift himself into a clearance bin at the local Blockbuster? Well, grab your favorite planet-friendly free-range NES controller, because we're about to see if Widget is worth saving the planet for. Start up Widget and you're met with a basic start menu, and then it's off to the game itself. The story here mostly mirrors the story of the cartoon, with Widget sent down to Earth to stop a few villains with ridiculously hilarious names from polluting our home planet. Initially, when you first start the game, Widget can only go to the first stage on the map screen, but after defeating that stage, then you can go about selecting the remaining available stages. In the meantime though, just go ahead and select that first one, and let's get to saving the planet, Widget style. As you can probably guess, Widget is your typical NES side-scrolling platform game that you've probably seen a billion times already. It's cute and colorful and filled with enemies to shoot at and platforms to jump across. Besides jumping around like a loon, Widget gets a super crappy version of Mega Man's Buster Gun to take out whatever enemies are in your way. Normally, I welcome any sort of projectile weapon in my platform games, but Widget's gun is one of those that can seemingly only ever shoot one bullet at a time, and won't even think about firing again until the previous bullet either hits the enemy or goes off screen. I've never liked these kinds of guns in games, and it doesn't help that Widget's gun, at least in its starting form, can take ages to get across the screen. So if you happen to miss the target, you'll be waiting a second before you can even shoot at it again. Thankfully, you can find a couple of powers throughout each stage to not only increase the damage of his gun, but also the speed at which it fires to make things a little less annoying. Just be sure not to die, since all of that extra power goes away as soon as you do. Besides jumping and shooting, Widget also brings his cartoon ability to shapeshift into various things into the game with him. At any point during the stage, just press the select button to bring up a list of currently available stuff that you can morph into. While the list is pretty short in the beginning, only giving you a stationary tank to change into, you'll gain more to use for every stage you beat. And thankfully the game does an excellent job at utilizing each form to make your way through the game. While most of the time you'll be using the different forms to find secret rooms that your normal form can't access, you'll also come across sections in each stage that simply aren't accessible until you find whatever thing you need to transform into to get past it. An early example of this is in the second stage, where you come across this expanse of water that you can't get across. The only way to get past this and beat the stage is to use the pterodactyl form, but you don't get that form until you beat the third stage. So even though you can select whatever stage you want to play, you may not actually be able to beat it until you figure out which form you need and where to get it. It's a refreshing change of pace from your typical NES platformer, and the game even encourages you to go back to previous stages to find power-ups that you couldn't reach before using your newfound abilities. It's a really neat touch, and would actually make Widget a decently fun game, if it wasn't for the fact that playing the game is mostly maddening. While Widget's overall premise is fairly unique for a mascot platform game based on a kid's cartoon show, the rest of the game mostly falls flat. First off, Widget controls incredibly stiff, making his movement and jumping never feel like you've quite got a handle on him. It doesn't help that most of the game is filled with leaps of faith that make Widget use every inch of his jump to make it across, or he'll be tumbling into yet another bottomless abyss below. The game's enemies also don't help anything either, as Atlas has decided to populate the game with some absolutely awful Mega Man-style enemies, taking the most annoying qualities from Mega Man's worst assholes and then tossing them into this game. You've got your enemies that can only be hit when they pop out of a shell for 1/10 of a second, your annoying flying enemies that come out of nowhere to knock you off whatever you're standing on, and even large enemies too big to jump over that rush at you with nothing you can do besides take a hit, and always produces a sigh of relief once they're dealt with if they didn't cause too many cheap hits or a sudden death. It's just not a fun game to progress in at any point. And you'd think with how bad the regular enemies are that the bosses would also be on another level of annoying, but surprisingly, most are incredibly easy, requiring nothing more than just running up next to them and jamming on the fire button until they die. Only a couple of bosses offer up any sort of mild strategy, but for the most part, they're thankfully the least of what will make you want to throw your controller in the game. At the end of the day, Widget for the NES does a few cool things that helped it stand out from the crowd. Well, I mean it would've if anyone even cared enough about Widget to play the game in the first place. Transforming into various forms and actually designing stages around making you use them to progress was a nice touch for a game like this. Unfortunately, that cool idea is baked on top of a cake that never had a solid foundation to begin with. All the cool level design and gimmicks won't ever matter if your game just isn't fun to play, and unfortunately, Widget just isn't a very fun game to play. I honestly can't even recommend Widget for the few things it does do right, since there are way too many games out there that ended up doing what Widget tried to do way better. So unless you just can't get enough of early 90s mascot games on the NES, then you'd probably have more fun going outside and actually picking up some trash to try and help the planet than ever playing Widget. Jackal exploded off the front lines and onto your NES back in 1988. Developed and published by Konami, Jackal for the NES was based on the quarter-crunching arcade game of the same name that was released into arcades a couple years prior, back in 1986. The arcade version of Jackal saw you advancing into enemy territory to save POWs that were captured by an unnamed army, and only a couple of guys piloting a super-powered Jeep could bring them home. Jackal in the arcades was definitely a ton of fun, but was unfortunately overshadowed by other heavy-hitting games of the time, so it never seemed to gain the popularity of other, more successful Konami-developed arcade games. Thankfully, that didn't stop Konami from bringing Jackal home to the NES and giving fans a chance to play it without having to beg their parents for more quarters. But was Jackal on the NES a good enough port to make fans and newcomers alike keep coming back for more hardcore Jeep action? Or was Jackal just a lost cause at this point, destined to take a backseat to Konami's more successful franchises? Well, buckle up into your favorite top-secret military Jeep, because we're about to see if Jackal on the NES can make your blood boil. Start up Jackal and you're treated to a brief opening cinematic that explains why anyone would be crazy enough to strap themselves into a Jeep and then attempt to plow through an entire enemy army with it. Essentially, it's up to you and your fellow Green Berets to lead a covert mission into enemy territory to save lost POWs, and the only way you can do that is with an experimental Jeep and a crew made up of race car drivers and stuntmen that are all apparently insane enough to think that this is a good idea. Once you're done with the story, go ahead and press start to get a quick overview of the area map, and then get ready to do your country proud by blowing up some other country with a Jeep. Get into the game and you're met with an overhead view of the action. You of course control that all-important super experimental Jeep, which just kinda looks like a regular Jeep to me, but hey, whatever. With the objective being to make your way through the level, save some POWs, fight a boss, and then rinse and repeat for the next level. Obviously, Jackal is a fairly simple overhead shooter, but it does do some interesting things to keep you on your toes. For one, even though this is some super crazy future military Jeep that's being piloted by the best of the best that the Green Berets have to offer, apparently no one knows how to shoot in any direction but straight forward. Yes, your main weapon will only ever target anything directly in front of you, which makes positioning your Jeep extremely important as you make your way through each level, especially since only one hit from anything in the game will take your so-called Super Jeep down. Thankfully, you do get a little help with your secondary weapon, which can be fired off in any direction that you can point the Jeep in. This is actually the weapon you'll probably end up using the most in the game, since not only can it take down just about every enemy in the game with one hit, it can also be powered up into a super bazooka that turns you into a one Jeep wrecking crew. Unfortunately, that's about all the help you'll get to make your way through the enemy ranks besides just occasionally using your Jeep to run over enemy soldiers, which is always satisfying if you happen to get blown up and lose your super awesome powered up bazooka. Besides just running and gunning, or I guess driving and gunning, through each stage, you're also tasked with saving POWs that are being held in various buildings in each map. If you find one, just chuck a grenade or missile at it and then collect the prisoners that run out. Collecting these little guys is how you go about powering up your secondary weapon, along with giving you a ton of points for those all-important extra lives. Toward the end of each stage, you'll see a white helicopter fly from the bottom of the screen, indicating that you're getting close to the helipad where you can drop those POWs off at. Usually these helipads are super well defended, so you'll need to take your time clearing out enemies before you can drop them off, since it totally sucks to get killed right at the helipad and lose most of the POWs that you've collected. You can at least pick up a few after you respawn, but the rest of the POWs that you collected have been blown to bits. You don't really need to collect the POWs if you don't want to, since there's no real penalty for not rescuing them. But getting your secondary gun up to its max level definitely makes the game way easier, so it's worth it to grab the POWs when you see them. Plus, I mean, they're POWs. How could you even sleep at night knowing you just passed them by? Once you drop off the POWs, the stage boss is usually just around the corner, and most are generally easy to deal with. None really offer up much challenge besides just dodging what they shoot at you, so it's more of an issue of just maneuvering your Jeep around them so you can get to where you can hit them. Beat the boss, and then it's on to the next stage to continue your Jeep rampage. Thankfully, the 6 stages that you'll be doing this in all have a decent amount of variety to keep the action from getting dull, and there's usually always a new obstacle or enemy to keep you on your toes just when you think you've got things down. Jackal isn't exactly the hardest or longest of NES games, but it's one of those games that's always fun to come back to on repeat playthroughs, especially if you got a friend around, and then the game gets even better with an awesome 2-player co-op mode. And even without a friend, there's still a lot of fun to be had here thanks to the variety and razor-sharp shoot-'em-up gameplay throughout. All said, Jackal for the NES is yet another all-time classic Konami game that ended up outdoing its bigger arcade brother in just about every way. While the arcade version of Jackal could never quite reach the heights of popularity it may have deserved, at least the NES version will always be remembered fondly by its many, many fans. On a personal note, I somehow never actually played Jackal as a kid. I honestly couldn't tell you why, since this is definitely the type of game I actively hunted down when I was scouring the rental store shelves looking for something me and my cousin could play over the weekend. And yeah, I'm sure Jackal would have easily been an all-time favorite with us had I picked it up. Unfortunately though, for whatever reason, I never played Jackal until way later in life, only to see what I missed out on in retrospect. Still, playing it today is, well, it's still just as fun as I'm sure it was back then. And Jackal is definitely one of those games that should be in heavy rotation for any NES fan looking to still have fun with the best that system has to offer. So if you've somehow missed out on Jackal for the NES up to this point, then do yourself a favor and grab it if you get the chance. It It may not make your blood boil, but Jackal is still a game totally worth heading into enemy territory for. Super C blasted its way onto your NES back in 1990. Developed and published by Konami, Super C is the follow-up to the groundbreaking action game Contra. Like the original Contra, Super C started out as an arcade game released in 1988 and featured the return of Bill and Lance as the two main heroes. The arcade version of the game was a huge improvement over the first Contra arcade game, which honestly wasn't that great. The sequel, though, turns everything up several notches and goes way over the top with insane action and explosions everywhere. Though to many of us that got our first taste of Contra on the NES originally, Super C in the arcade still just didn't feel like a Contra game. Konami would finally come to the rescue 2 years later with the port of Super C to the NES, and it finally looked like the very thing us hardcore Contra fans were hoping for, a true sequel to Contra that looked and played like the original. So was Super C the follow-up we were all foaming at the mouths for all of those years? Or was Super C maybe just a bit too much like the original Contra that we'd all played for hours on end already? Well, grab your favorite headband and weapon power-up, because we're about to see if Super C can take down Red Falcon yet again. Start up Super C and you're met with that iconic Konami scrolling title screen, and then you're tossed directly into the game as soon as you press the start button. Once you're actually playing the game, you get Contra. If you've never played a Contra game before, then it's as simple as running to the right and shooting everything that's running or shooting at you. I'm not gonna spend a good chunk of this review on the finer points of Contra gameplay, since we've already got a lengthy review of the original NES Contra already posted on this channel. And while Super C may look like the exact same game from before, it actually has a few significant differences that sets it apart from its previous version. First off, yes, the gameplay is basically identical to Contra. If you've ever played the original game, then coming to Super C will literally be the exact same experience as far as how your character controls and what he can do. Again, we've already spent enough time on that in the other Contra review, so let's just move on and see what Super C offers over the original game. Even though the action in Contra may essentially be the same as before, the guns you get have received some changes. The fire rifle in the original Contra was always that one gun that you hated to get, since all it did was shoot balls of energy in a slow circular pattern, usually ending up flying over enemies' heads or just being way too slow and inaccurate for a game that demands super fast and precise shooting. The new and improved fire rifle now shoots a massive ball of energy out in front of you that explodes into smaller balls of energy once it hits something, taking down anything else around it. You can even charge it up for a larger explosion, which does some insane damage if used correctly. The other returning weapons also get some changes, with the machine gun now being a complete beast of a weapon that can mow down enemies and bosses alike in no time. The fan favorite spread shot receives a huge damage nerf though from its previous iteration, and is now only really useful for areas where enemies swarm you, since it doesn't do much more damage than your default gun now. The laser rifle gets a bit of an increase in usefulness with a better, faster short-range attack if you jam on the fire button, while still retaining its way over the top damage that it had in the first game. The new and improved guns really changes how you play the game as well, so Contra is finally no longer just grinding out a level until you find the spread shot and then rampaging through the rest of the stage like a madman. Now each weapon is totally viable and have their own unique areas where they work best, and that alone is totally worth the price of Super C's admission for some of us that were endlessly tired of fighting with friends over who got the spread gun in the first game. Powered up guns are nice and all, but it just wouldn't be a Contra game without some really awesome stages to use them in, and this is another area where Super C really shines. While the game may at first seem like it's starting off with a more hardcore military theme, things definitely start to get way more alien in the latter half of the game, which almost makes it feel like two entirely separate games once you've gone all the way through it. Super C also does away with those cool third-person bunker stages from the first game and now replaces them with a more commando-like top-down perspective. Personally, I love those original bunker stages, but it's hard to deny just how much they slowed the pace of the game down, along with just being kinda awkward overall. The new top-down stages only make a couple of appearances in the game, but both stages offer up a fun new perspective for Contra vets. And it's even more fun in co-op mode, since now both players can keep to their own areas without getting into each other's way as much. Bosses, of course, make their return in Super C and get a much-needed shot in the arm in terms of keeping you on your toes. Those bosses in the first Contra definitely looked amazing for the time, but they really didn't do a whole lot lot besides that. Super C's bosses are much more mobile overall, and feel a lot less like the static sprites that their ancestors were. Even the larger bosses usually have some sort of neat gimmick to keep you guessing and moving around, with Stage 3's boss being the only one that kind of feels like a holdover from the first game. It should also be mentioned that even though Super C features the same amount of levels that Contra had, it still feels like a longer, more substantial and challenging game than the original, so you won't be plowing through Super C in an hour or two. Well, as long as you don't use any cheats at least. Overall, Super C's new weapons, settings, and challenging bosses make it feel like a much more refined game than the first Contra. Believe it or not, there's a lot of people back in the day that were actually disappointed with Super C, due to it just kind of feeling like it was treading water and being more of the same. Thankfully though, it's one of those games that's aged really well over time, and it's obviously an essential playthrough now if you're a fan of the Contra series. As for me, Contra was my all-time favorite game back when I was a kid. So of course I grabbed Super C at the mall the instant I could save up enough money to do so, and I wasn't disappointed in the least. Even if Super C was just a few more stages of Contra with no changes at all, I'd have probably still loved every minute of it. But all the fun changes and additions, even as minor as many of them are, really made Super C feel like a full-featured sequel in my book, and I still feel that way when playing through it these days. So if you're a fan of Contra, then there's really no excuse not to check out its NES sequel. While Super Contra on the Super NES may have been the huge step in the series that everyone was wanting out of Super C, there's no denying that this game still has more than enough firepower and action to keep any Contra fan satisfied.